To do this, I need a new base plate for my trim router, and I've got a scrap of plexiglass that I can cut down to size to make it from. Next, I need to mark the center so I can drill a hole there for the router bit to come through. The bit that I'm using is 1¼ inches, and I didn't want to change the speed on my drill press, so I got a little bit of melting that I need to clean up on the spindle sander. Now I can take off the old base plate and put some double-sided tape on the new base plate so that I can stick the old base plate on to use it as a template to drill the holes. The bit that I'm using is exactly the same size as the holes that are in the original base plate, so that the holes in the new plate will be lined up as precisely as possible. I also need to countersink those holes slightly so that the screws will be sitting below the surface. I'm building this project entirely from scratch, starting with that base plate that I just made. And this part right here is the top that I'm making from 1/2-inch plywood. This part is not strictly necessary, but it does help to make assembly a little bit quicker. And that's cutting dados in the underside of the top for the 2 side panels. I need to make a recess in the top for that new base plate to fit into so that it will be flush with the top. I'm using my compact compass to draw a circle for the base of the router to fit into, and then I'll cut that out with the jigsaw and clean it up on the spindle sander. And I could have just cut this out square, leaving just enough for the edge of the base plate to sit on, but I want this to be a friction fit as much as possible. And that's because I don't want to use screws to hold this in place while I'm using it. I'm going to be using the router itself to cut the recess, and I'm using a very early version of a jig that I've been thinking about for a while that will help do this kind of thing. And it's basically 2 L-shaped pieces that fit together, and you use these spacer blocks that are cut to the right size to locate it. And then when it is clamped down, I can double check with the base of the router to make sure that it is the right size. Like I said before, I'm looking for a good, snug fit. And I can chisel out the corners in the plywood to make them square, but I'm going to round the corners on the plexiglass instead. And here you can see how it fits nice and snug. With that done, I can move on to making the side panels from more scrap plywood. And I'm going to pin these together so that I can cut both out at the same time. And the reason why I'm doing these cutouts is to make it easy to clamp down to a workbench. I figured I'd round over the corners on the top as well so that it would match everything else I've done. I'm using polyurethane construction adhesive to glue the side panels permanently in place. Another option is to just use screws to put this together, and that way you can quickly take it apart and store it flat. I've got another scrap of plywood to make the back, and it's 3/4 inch this time. I'll cut it to size, get it tacked in place, and then drive in screws without glue this time. Whether it needs a fence or not is really up to you. In fact, you can just use any straight piece of wood and clamp that down like I'm doing here. And I'm doing that because I want to make a proper fence, and I need to cut slots in the main rail. I'm drilling holes here for hanger bolts that will make it so that I can clamp this down to the top. And a hanger bolt has coarse threads on one end for screwing into wood and fine threads on the other side for nuts. And like a proper fence on a proper router table, this is going to have movable faces as well, so that you can close the gap around the bit. And that's the reason I cut those slots. These are small pieces of 1/2-inch plywood that I glued together already to form an L shape. And the plywood I use for these is just a little bit thinner than the plywood I use for the top, so that when you tighten those wing nuts, it will clamp the fence down tight to the top. Then I can get the movable faces in place, once again with wing nuts holding them on. And without changing the bit that I already used, I thought I would do a quick jointing operation to demonstrate how the thing works. If you set the fence so that the bit is just taking off a very small amount, you don't have to put any offset on the outfeed face. All you need to do is take a few passes and you'll wind up with an edge that's straight and square and smooth. And when you're finished using it, it takes no time at all to remove the router so you can use it for something else.